Folks, I've been asked to introduce Joel to you. Many of you have already met Joel because he's going to be a resident here, and he's already, I thought he was already. He's a regular at Wind Down on Fridays, so many of you already met him. Joel is from here in Greensboro. They're not originally. He came here in 1978 with Burlington Industries. He was born in a little town, Lebanon, Tennessee, which is near Nashville, Tennessee. And I think from there you went to work for Burlington. Well, you were in the Air Force for a bit. And he was in Texas with Burlington Industries. They transferred him to here in 1978. His son, I believe, gave him, when he moved here, gave him a book about interesting facts about North Carolina, and this was one of them which caught his eye, and he started researching it. And this is what he came up with. That's right here. And I understand we have a copy of this in the library.
About three
copies. 3 copies in the library. I've read the book. It's not a quick read, but it's an interesting read, and it's hard to put down once you get going. I think you'll enjoy this, and we're glad to have him as of, I think, May. You got a move-in date in May, so he'll be a permanent resident here at that point. So welcome Joel Dobson to Whitestone.
Thank you, Robert, with that very nice introduction. Some of it is even true. And thank you all for coming. I really, really appreciate that, and hope you get something out of this. Before I start the talk, I want to introduce 3 friends. There's Bill and Jane Frist that have been especially helpful for me this past year, which has been a very sorrowful year, and their songship and their friendship is greatly appreciated. Bernita Reed was a nurse working with my wife Judy, and we calculate they delivered around 4,000 babies, and at Wesley Long and Women's Hospital. And after that career, she started a second career of interviewing and videotaping people and recording their stories. And so she is now working on the African American Oral History and Research Project of Greensboro, North Carolina. These histories will be preserved at the State Archives. She's the author of a 2-volume book, The Slave Families of Thomas Jefferson. So if you would, please welcome Bernita Reed and Bill and Jane Frist.
And maybe we have a potential Monday night speaker.
Yes.
Here.
Oh. There was supposed to be a 4th, I don't know, musketeer?
Yeah.
His name is Adam Randolph. He had a physical today and got the shingle shot, and didn't feel too good. So he's undergoing some treatment for pancreatic cancers and things like that. Does set you back. He would have been here. Adam is was a pilot, and what other pilots call a sling wing, or a formation of parts flying together. In other words, a helicopter. And he did it while being shot at in an unfriendly neighborhood. He picked up many wounded in Vietnam, out of hot zones. He was shot down 3 times. And he did many search and rescue missions, and he did it for over 2 tiers. 2 tours. And there was something else too. He was one of the 4 young men of color who desegregated VMI, Virginia Military Institute, in 1972. If he was here today, he would be reluctantly standing up at this time. The second point I want to say is nothing that you see or hear tonight is classified. Some documents may have been classified at some point in the past, but they're declassified. It's been a subject of note lately, so I just wanted to put your minds at ease. So nobody in dark suits and sunglasses should be knocking on your door saying, "We're from the FBI and we have a couple of questions." At least not from this. There may be other reasons for that. So I wanted to share with you tonight some of the things you may not have heard, simply because it wasn't known very much. The most common phrase that I heard during my research was, "Did that really happen?" Even David Letterman said that on his show. Yes, it really did happen. And now there will be a couple of times in the program where I'll stop and ask if there are questions or comments anybody wants to make. But please stop me at any time if I'm confusing or if I've messed up something that you need to be clarified. Please just feel free to do that. I want to start, and I'm going to be sitting down because my remote is remote. And thanks to Bob for recording this. You guys have a real gem here. You really do. It's probably safe for me to say, noting all the gray hair in this room, that most of you will remember where you were in 1962, in October of 1962, because that was the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was a brand new Air Force second lieutenant stationed at Little Rock Air Force Base. Is the mic working? Yes. We had B-58s and Titan II missiles. And I was at the Bachelor Officer Quartered Rec Room that night on, I think it was October 22nd, listening and watching the President of the United States when he said these chilling words: "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union." And that was really scary to me because I was right in the middle of a bunch of young nuclear warriors, lieutenants and captains whose job was to go fly those bombers and man those holes for the missiles, for the ICBMs. And they all looked very worried to me. And it would be these men, and they were all men at that time. There were no women on combat crews, at least in 1961. It would be these men who would be part of that band of brothers who would launch that full retaliatory response against the Soviet Union. So the Cuban Missile Crisis became the standard, the benchmark of how to measure disasters or dangerous times in our national safety. It was how other emergencies would measure up that could have the possibility of starting World War III. And that's what we were looking at in 62. So tonight I want to tell you about an equally as dangerous situation that I believe occurred just like the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it occurred 1 year before that. So here's the summary of the basics of the things that I'm going to tell you tonight. About 30 minutes after midnight on January 24th, 1961, and 118 miles from where we're sitting right now, a B-52 bomber came apart in midair, and it scattered its 8-man crew, its huge fuel load of JP-4, and 2 hydrogen bombs down on the community of Faro, which is 12 miles north of Goldsboro. Now, why that airplane came apart in midair will be discussed later on. This happened just 3 days after Kennedy's inauguration. That was one reason why it wasn't well known. I saw a lot of newspaper articles, and it would be about what Jackie was wearing all over, and then down at the bottom, B-52 crash, 3 killed, no danger, or something like that. Robert McNamara, the gentleman on the left, he was Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, would say that if just 2 wires, either leading to or in a small specific switch inside either one of those 2 H-bombs, if just 2 wires had crossed in the breakup of that aircraft, there would have been a nuclear detonation. There was no doubt in his mind on U.S. soil. Now, the fact is, it would have been much worse than that, I now believe, after several more years of digging. McNamara said later that he was worried that a designated commander might see that detonation not as an accident, but as an all-out attack on the United States, and would launch that retaliatory response. And it was the commander of the Strategic Air Command, Thomas Power, that he was talking about. He was actually my boss at that time. I never met him, but he was up there somewhere. General Power was authorized to do that very thing under 2 conditions. If he thought a nuclear attack on the U.S. had begun, and if the president could not be reached. If those 2 things, he could do it. And I believe he was of the mindset to do it. We'll look at his mindset later, and I might need a psychologist to help. Is there a psychologist in the house? He was authorized to launch under the policy of pre-delegated authority. That authority was in place. It was signed by President Eisenhower 2 years before in 1959. Pre-delegated authority was a secret, even from our allies. Also, what was not known at that time, that the communication system would have probably been fried by detonation. And it was due to this new, yet to be fully analyzed phenomenon called EMP, electromagnetic pulse. They just didn't have bombs big enough to upset EMP like we had then. So, with those happy thoughts in mind, let's move along to what happened that few minutes after midnight in Goldsboro. First, what is a broken arrow? A broken arrow is an accidental nuclear detonation or an accident that could cause an accidental detonation, but that does not create a risk of an outbreak of nuclear war. That's a bad thing, but there's one thing worse, a nuke flash, code word nuke flash. What that is a detonation or possible detonation which does create a risk of an outbreak of nuclear war. And we had a lot of megatonnage. You see where we had a peak there. We figured out how to build those things. We built up a big stockpile, and then it sort of tapered off in the 1990s. But in 1960, we had a platform. Nuclear bombs, and it was primarily bombers at that time. The Navy had not come on board with their nuclear subs at that time. There was one, the George Washington, that was being checked out, but it was on a shakedown cruise when this happened. The Navy had some tactical nuclear weapons, and that means they're light enough to be carried by single engine airplanes. So SAC, Strategic Air Command, was the big muscle. And peace is our profession was their motto. War is just a hobby is something that somebody added, always somehow added to signs about it. SAC was really created by General Curtis LeMay. He did this after his brilliant campaign in South Pacific in World War II. At 1957, he was promoted. He went up to Washington, D.C., and he was replaced by General Thomas Power. A lot of you don't know who Power was, but you do know what happened here. General Thomas Power led that firebombing mission on Tokyo on the night of March 8 and 9, 1945. He was in the lead plane, and he said he killed 100,000 people in one night. And he did it by not using an atomic bomb, but using these things, incendiary bombs. The houses in Tokyo were made out of wood and paper, and they planned it this way. There was a 500-pound cluster bomb. When they dropped it, there were a bunch of them in the B-29, but when they dropped it, the shells would break away, and the cluster bombs inside would scatter. There were two little ribbons there that made sure that it was pointed the right direction, and it was splattered napalm all over. It was designed to penetrate the tile roof, and then splattered napalm inside the houses. General LeMay, bless his heart, he interspersed some 500-pound high explosive bombs in amongst the incendiary with time-delayed fuses. The purpose of them was to wipe out Tokyo Fire Department when they showed up to fight the fire. In 1961, headquarters SAC was in Omaha, Nebraska. They had the big board there that kept up with all the SAC flights all over the world. This is the big muscle for SAC. It was the B-52 bomber. Thing weighed close to 500,000 pounds on takeoff. It could rotate its tires to land or take off in a 40-knot side wind. Here, the wheels are pointed right at the camera. It would take off coming straight at you, but angled off at the side. This was the ground alert responding to their weapons. They could get off the ground very, very quick. They call this the bust out, where they would take off one right after the other and go to their pre-selected routes. A lot of you have heard of Chrome Dome. Chrome Dome was the name of the routes that was used. You can see down by the southern route here at the bottom. This is where the Goldsboro flight, it was called Keep 19. And Keep 19 was scheduled to take off from here, fly over to England, loiter on site, fly back, and land at Seymour Johnson. It was a 24-hour mission. It was to replicate in all aspects the distance, the fuel, time, weapons, and crew that it would take to fly up Chrome Dome. It was not officially a Chrome Dome flight, though. This was the bomb that Keep 19 was carrying. It was carrying 2 of them. This is the Mark 39 H-bomb. It's 11.5 feet long, weighs 3.5 tons, and it is 3.9 megatons. In English, that means that if you take all the destructive power that has ever been blown up in war, all conventional bombs, all shells, all torpedoes, all mines, and you lumped them all together, one bomb would be more powerful than all of that. And they had 2 of them. This is what was inside that bomb. The gray box on the left is really a parachute pack. It actually had 4 parachutes in sequence because it was so heavy. First a little one would open, it would pull out a bigger one, and then the last one was huge. It was over 100 feet wide. And that was to slow down this monster of a bomb to give the crew in the airplane time enough to get out of Dodge, get out of the blast zone. So there's 2 basic components, the primary and the secondary. The primary is, the primary is essentially an atomic bomb. The secondary is essentially the fuel that changes an atomic bomb into an H-bomb. And that is the point, that secondary is the item that is still in the ground at Faro. My son said, there's an H-bomb in the ground at Goldsboro. And I said, I don't believe that. But there is a secondary in the ground, and it has about 4 kilos of plutonium in it. And that's nasty stuff. It has a half-life of 25,000 years. It's not going away anytime soon. A grain of plutonium, if inhaled in an aerosol, will give you lung cancer and will probably kill you. 1 grain. And that had, I don't know how many grains there are in a kilogram, but it had 4.5 kilos. That's about 9 pounds of nasty stuff. It's still in the ground down there. Probably the steel shell around it has corroded. Hopefully the plutonium is not breaking down in the water aquifer and riding down toward Wilmington. So atomic bomb works this way. It takes a huge amount of electricity on a bunch of different wires, 1 wire going to each, 1 detonator on the outside of the atomic bomb, and all of them have to detonate at exactly the same instant. And when they do, they ignite that red product, which is really TNT. It's a high explosive. And that high explosive will compress the blue cantaloupe-sized core from a less than critical mass into a critical mass. And when that happens...
All those cables are exactly the same length.
I'm sorry? Yes, all of them are exactly the same length, because any distance will mean that one would be a little bit shorter, a little bit quicker, a little bit slower. So they all have, the electricity has to arrive at exactly the same time. So when that goes off and it ignites the fuel, this is what you get. So, the airplane, the B-52G. The B-52 is called a Buff, B-U-F-F. That stands for Big, Ugly, Fat Fellow, or something like that. It's a lighter weight model. The G model is a lighter weight, and they did that intentionally so they could put more fuel on it to fly the longer distances for Chrome Dome. They took out the weight and a very important part of the wing. They changed the alloy of the wing structure that holds that wing to the airplane. And that really was the reason why wing came off that airplane. As soon as that happened, they quit making the G models and grounded them, as it should have, but right before this happened.
They should have what?
Have grounded them because of the weakness in the wing. The strength of Chrome Dome was having air-to-air refueling. That's the KC-135. And that's what it looks like from the KC-135, where the refueling operators flies. He's actually got little wings there that can fly and into the receptacle and transfer 100,000 pounds of fuel in about 15 minutes. That means the center of gravity, Robert, changes real fast for both airplanes.
Yes.
So they got to do some heavy trim work at all times.
Yeah.
This was the actual flight that Keep 19 was going to fly. It was going to take off from Goldsboro, do some exercise out at sea, and then fly to a point north of the Azores, and then turn around and come back and land at Goldsboro. That would replicate the distance that it would be flying when it was actually flying Chrome Dome.
So, how many planes are in the air at one time?
At least 12, sometimes 16. The maximum in the air was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and 65 were in the air.
Mm.
This was the pilot, the aircraft commander, Scott Tulloch, a nice guy. He passed away a few years ago. I met his wife, and she was quite a character. His co-pilot, Dick Rardon, the electronic warfare officer, Bill Wilson, and the only enlisted man on board, Frank Barnish, was the tail gunner. And even though he sat up front, he operated the tail gun in the back by remote control and television. There was another pilot along that time. This is the third pilot, Lieutenant Adam Maddox. He was educated right here in Greensboro, A&T. He grew up in Maysville, North Carolina. He was a fighter pilot. He flew F-86s. And in the 1960s, SAC needed a bunch of pilots, qualified pilots. So they transferred whole squadrons of fighter pilots into SAC. They did not much like that. They went from flying a fast sports car to flying a bus, they called it. So this, they called that being circumcised when they got moved involuntarily. But they saluted smartly, reported for duty, and he was the third pilot. And that was because they were going to be in the air for 25 hours. They would rotate around as to who was acting as pilot and who was resting. The B-52 had 2 decks. The people up front were on top rather, was Major Tulloch, the pilot. Here's the co-pilot, here's Maddox. In the back, the warfare officer and the gunner. So those 2 guys are facing backwards. These 4 had ejection seats. If they could eject upwards. Maddox had a parachute, did not have an ejection seat. We'll get to that in a minute. Downstairs was the radar navigator and the navigator. The difference between those 2 jobs is the navigator keeps up with where the airplane is and where it's going. The radar navigator is essentially the bombardier that drops the atomic bomb. That day, they had a ride-along. Major Eugene Richards, he was getting in his flight hours for the month. He did not have an ejection seat. So there was Gene Sheldon, the radar nav, and the nav, and Eugene Richards. The
two navigators down in the black hole. This is their job. This is what they look at. Nobody can see outside except the pilots. Nobody has windows. Now this airplane, the B-52, is now flying, and it was 60 years ago. It's scheduled to fly another 40 years. 100 years of a bomber life. Notice this radar navigator's right hand. This is a modern version of that, probably one of those same airplanes. They've changed the avionics quite a bit, changed the engines out, but the job of the radar navigator is pretty much the same. Okay, if they had a planned bailout, now planned bailout means you got a little bit of time, it's not an emergency. Adam Maddox would, as shown by the green there, he would go down that ladder, and the navigator in the bottom would be the first out of the airplane. And the reason he's the first out, he would eject downward. The reason he was first, they needed to have a hole in the bottom of the airplane that the other two ride-alongs could jump through. So that was his purpose. Richard would take a couple of steps forward, and Maddox would come down the ladder. Of course, if it was a true emergency, the pilot would hit the bailout alarm, and a red light would start flashing right in front of each man who had a workstation. Also, a horn would flash, and at that point, horn would start blasting, and at that point it's time for everybody to get out. I had a pilot tell me he was just him and a co-pilot flying a two-seater, and he said he always did a pre-flight interview with his co-pilot, and he said, if I say bail out and you say huh, it's your airplane. So after you bail out, your seat falls away, your parachute inflates, and you float slowly and safely to Earth. That black object below him is a life boat. It's inflated automatically as he bails out. The reason why they have these, the life raft is the Earth is 75% covered in water. So the odds are 3 out of 4 you're going to get wet. So if he was definitely over dry land, he could release that life raft and it would blow away. This is the gunner seat, ejection seat, and he had, each one of them on the upper deck had these 2 handles, and when you push down on that yellow handle, it would pop up and several things would happen all at once. There would be 2 ankle grabbers that would reach out and grab your ankles and pull them under your seat. Your seat straps would tighten up so tight that you'd swear that it's going to crush you. The hatch above you would blow off into the slipstream. Your workstation would retract violently against the bulkhead. One guy told me it was a good idea if you knew this was going to happen to take everything off, because they would be airborne projectiles you would hit on the way out. And it would also arm this right here, which was the trigger. And that just had one job to do. You pull that, and 2.5 seconds later, you're floating safely and slowly down to Earth. The guys downstairs, they ejected downward. They had their trigger was between their legs. You see the ankle restraints here. They would come out and grab you and tuck it. The downstairs stations had these 2 paddles that pushed down to get your knees in the right position for blasting downward. because it was said that if you left anything outside that area, it was gonna stay in the airplane. And then you would float slowly and safely down to Earth. Major Richard didn't have any of those things. This was his seat. It was a cushion beside the crew urinal, that white thing there. This is an H model B-52 configured to land. The landing gear is just beginning to turn, rotate into position and come down. The flaps are down. It's slowing to landing speed. And I say all that because that night, about 9 o'clock, they had completed their second refueling mission. They were over Columbia, South Carolina, when the tanker told them, you got a huge fuel leak in your starboard wing, right here. Fuel was gushing out at the rate that, afterwards they estimated that they lost 19 tons of fuel in 2 minutes. So that had to be a pretty good sized hole. Major Tulloch shut off these 2 engines immediately because it's not a good thing to have fire in the neighborhood of fuel gushing. He made the decision to fly out to Wilmington. He flew beyond Wilmington and flew a sort of a racetrack pattern for 2 hours to burn off fuel and work the emergency list under what to do. The tanker stayed with him, although at about several thousand feet above him and a mile in front, just in case he blew up. The reason he wanted to be out at sea was to be near the Coast Guard stations at Oak Island in case they had needed recovery real fast. So they were having all kinds of trouble then. They had radio failures, pump failures. One thing was going wrong right after the other. They were trying to balance the airplane, but it was flying pretty good on 6 engines, but it was still a series of things going wrong. Wing commander told him, okay, come on back, land at Seymour Johnson. So, Robert, you know this route here. The wind was out of the west, blowing at about 20 knots at the ground level, and the long east-west runway there at Seymour Johnson, they would be landing in this direction, into the wind. So they were under control of Raleigh approach. They came in from the south at about 15,000 feet. It was around a little bit after midnight. It was a clear night. They Tulloch wanted the gear down and the flaps down, and that's very unusual to do that far out. Normally they don't do it until they're right before they're landing, but he was doing it in this area right here so that he could shut off everything electrical that he didn't need, just as a safety factor. He had flown 38 missions over Japan, and he knew that if you even thought you were going to have trouble with flaps, you didn't want to wait till you were about to land to find out that trouble. They were turning left, and they were just headed. They could see the runway lights from that far out when they felt a thud, a screech of metal. The airplane started rolling to the right, and the wing folded up and broke off the airplane. And it crashed right up there at Faro. Now I'd drawn this, what I thought it looked like at that time. People were bailing out. There's the 2 weapons, the 2 bombs flung sideways out of the airplane. Parachute on one of them opened. The parachute on the other one did not open. It was cut to pieces. So people were bailing out. The wing was broken off. Adam Maddox knew that he could not get down that ladder to go out the bottom, so he did something truly desperate. He elected to jump out the hatch right above the pilots, right there. Nobody had ever done that and lived because they'd always been hit by the tail and killed. The only reason that he wasn't killed is the tail had just broken off. So he got outside, got a good parachute, said, "Thank you, Lord," for about the third time in a few seconds. And then the airplane blew up and collapsed his chute. So he got the chute open again, said, "Thank you, Lord," again, and was coming down right in the fire on Big Daddy's Road. He didn't know about the name of the road, but he knew there was fire there. There was fire everywhere.
Joe, how high up were they when they had a bell?
I'm sorry?
How high up were they when they had the bell?
They were about 15,000 feet and descending some. But they were pretty high. They had strong winds up there too.
Let me say, if
Yeah.
I might add, just
Sure.
from a pilot's perspective, unusual to put flaps down and gear down at that altitude.
Right.
Descending. If they had waited to the normal time,
It'd have crashed.
nobody
would have gotten out.
Nobody would have gotten out at all.
Right.
So it was because of that. The stress of the flaps coming down put a terrific stress on the wings, which they do.
And plus he was in a turn. He was banking, which put about, what, 2 Gs?
Yeah, 60-degree bank, which gave him 2 Gs already, and then the flaps coming down with that.
Is more than
and
it
then,
can handle.
A lot of force on that wing, which just folded it up
Yeah.
immediately.
One thing it's in the book somewhere. The fuel clamps that held the big flexible fuel tubes together were made by a company called Marmon. Now they don't know that this had the Marmon clamps on there, but Marmon clamps were made by one of the 4 Marx Brothers companies, Zeppo. That's why it was named Marmon. So I don't think the Marx Brothers had anything to do with the crash of B-20. But maybe. So Adam Maddox got out, got a good chute, and he was blown several miles away. He came down, he landed in the mud right behind a farmer's house. There were people out on the porch looking away from him. They were looking at all this fire all over the place, from horizon to horizon. They didn't know that a man in a parachute had just come over him and landed right behind him. So he gathered up his chute, walked up, stood on the porch and said, "Excuse me." They turned around and nearly scared him to death, he said. He took off his helmet. He said, my name's Adam Maddox. I'm from Matesville. I'm not from Mars. I bailed out of a B-52. Can somebody take me to the gate of the Seymour Johnson? So they loaded him up. Everybody was in the cars. Nobody said a word. They drove him to the gate at Seymour Johnson, let him out, and sped away. He has no idea who they were, but there was a lot of people in there. He gathered up his parachute, went up to the gate, the guards at the gate, and he was really in shock at that time. And they wanted to know, what did he want? And he said he had just bailed out of a B-52 that crashed. And they didn't know there had been a B-52. They hadn't heard about that. The tower thought that Keep 19 was still out there flying someplace. They had radio trouble. So he told them there had been a B-52 crash, and he needed some help. they asked to see his military ID, and he didn't have it because his pockets were ripped open. So they did the only thing they knew to do. They arrested him for stealing government property, the parachute that was still under his arm. But then he was coming out of his shock, and he was announcing in no uncertain terms. He was an officer in the United States Air Force, and they had just crossed the line. And so they were thinking, oh boy, that we probably have. And then the co-pilot showed up. Somebody delivered him in a red pickup truck. I wish I knew who that was. And so he and Adam Maddox said, call the tower, tell them there's a broken arrow, roll the fire trucks. So that's how the fire trucks went out to the fire, started fighting it. This was a little bit after dawn. They're recovering the body of the tail gunner, Frank Barnish, right there. Nearby was the body of Eugene Richards, the ride-along. About 3 miles away, in the top of a pine tree, was the body of Gene Shelton, the radar navigator. His helmet had come off when he ejected, and he was hit by debris. They didn't have a ladder to get up tall enough to get his body recovered, so they called for a helicopter like this. It's a twin-bladed helicopter, so it doesn't need a tail rotor. There's no rotor back there. They could take off those back doors, and a fireman and a medic climbed aboard. They went over. He lowered down right over the top of that pine tree, and the fireman and the medic grabbed handfuls of parachute, scotched themselves real good, and the pilot went up. And then he moved over and lowered Gene Shelton's body to earth again. This is the site on Big Daddy's Road. Later on, most of the biggest debris had been hauled away at that time. You can see the direction of flight, the way they were going when the thing started coming apart. It scattered debris all over the place. The fire was enormous. A lot of the women told me, several women told me, and one man, they thought it was the end of the world, that it was that much fire. They were that scared to death. The two bombs fell out. Bomb number 1 there on Shackelford Road, that was the one that had the parachute on it. Bomb number 2 did not have the parachute, and it came in, hit the wet soil, traveling about 700 miles an hour, and just kept on going. So you can see where Maddox landed, and over by Bullhead Ridge, that's where Gene Shelton's body was, right there. Major Tulloch, the aircraft commander, came down in a tree, saw water below him, and released his chute straps and fell about 20 feet. He didn't think it was that far, and it was really cold. He said he almost drowned. He got out, and he decided he was going to wait on dry, it wasn't dry, on mud until sunup. He did not want his buddies back at headquarters SAC to say, well, Tulloch got out okay, but he came down in a tree and fell out of it and drowned in a swamp. So he got out, walked to the road, a milkman picked him up and took him to a farmhouse with a phone where he called his wife.
Question.
Yes.
They didn't need it at 2,000 feet, but I'm guessing that there was a cylinder of oxygen with the ejection seat, or
Oh, yeah.
what they were wearing.
That's a good question. They had some, what they call a green apple. It has a small, it was a release for a small amount of oxygen, but they came down so fast they didn't need it, really.
Well, you don't need it at 2,000 feet either.
But their ejection seats were powered by compressed air. It was not a rocket like you see in single engine fighters. That was because fighters set one guy in the front, one guy in the back. bombers set two guys side by side. So it's not friendly to have your neighbor blast off with a flame of fire coming at you. So there, the debris was scattered all over the place. There's that bomb that was in the tree. I don't know if you've seen pictures of it. The other bomb, oh, this is the same bomb. It's not a very good photograph, but they had removed the parachute pack at this time, and those guys are working. These are EOD team from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. They are rendering safe that Mark 39. You've seen movies where the guy's cutting the wires to a bomb. Well, they know which wires to cut. So they're looking for that an arm safe switch we'll be talking about. The Public Affairs Office at the base made this statement. They said four things. There were two bombs, both have been recovered, they were unarmed, and there's absolutely no danger. They were right about one thing. There were two bombs. Jack Revelle, a lieutenant at Dayton, Ohio, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He was the commander of the EOD unit up there that was going to be put in charge of this Broken Arrow. And he had a very fast ride from Ohio to North Carolina. It was a two-seater jet. He got here in less than an hour. That's 450 miles in a little bit less than an hour. Of course, he had clearance all the way. This photo was taken several days later. This is this team that was brought down on a cargo plane right behind him with their instruments and tools. You can see some what looks like mining equipment back here, and that's what it is. It's digging equipment provided by a company in Goldsboro called T.A. Loving. They got the contract to help. What they're looking for is that arm safe switch. This little devil is in each bomb, and it's supposed to be on a green S for safe instead of the red A for armed. So it was that amount of wiring between that device and the radar detector, the radar navigator. This is in the bomb, and the wiring would go to the radar navigator. That was the wiring that McNamara was so concerned about, that if they crossed, they could have moved this to the arm. This is the bomb in the ground. They are removing the tail, the parachute pack, and all of those guys are looking right at this spot right here, which is where the arm safe switch is. One of them, Sergeant Larry Lack, called up to Revelle. Jack Revelle was up at the top of the hole. He said, "Lieutenant, we found the arm safe switch." And Revelle said, "Great, good." And Sergeant Lack said, "Not good. It's on arm." That meant these guys were thinking very seriously, is this the last instant of my life before this bomb goes off? It turns out the switch was actually on safe, but the indicator, due to impact with the earth, was on arm. But it's still kind of nervous at that point. They found all the components of the bomb except the secondary. And they found the hole where the secondary kept going. They probed as far down as they had probes, which is about 70 feet, and they hit nothing. So the secondary, they calculated, is down 180 feet, plus or minus 10 feet. And the government, the Corps of Engineers, bought a 400-foot circular easement around that spot. They can't dig below 5 feet. They can't put a house on it. Can't put any fence post up. They can farm it though. So remember this. when they got down to the remnants of that atomic bomb, they took the traditional, the pink stuff, the high explosives out a chunk at a time, put them in oil-soaked burlap bags and stored them way away. And then they found the core, the plutonium core. Jack Revelle brought that up in his gloved hands. So they found all the parts to the bomb except that secondary. They dug for 5 months using the mining equipment. They were below the water table there at the Nahunta swamp. Water was pouring in. They had 16 pumps going, pumping it out, and they never got a hit on that. So I actually found this interesting little piece of information. This is a Twix. You know what a Twix is. This is page 5 of that Twix. And it says paragraph. In any case, it is considered advice of LASL, that's Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico. So it's their advice that some water samples be taken for analysis and the hole be filled up and forgotten. They filled it up, but were not forgotten. Exactly right. Now it's going to show you what impact a 3.9 megaton bomb would do over Wilson County, North Carolina, but you don't know where Wilson County is. I don't know. It's all one big flat county.
Near Rocky Mountain.
Yeah,
So,
right, okay.
Rocky Mountain area.
So I figured that everybody knew about New York City. Here's Manhattan Island, here's Central Park, here's New Jersey, here's Staten Island. And what if this 3.9 megaton bomb went off right about there? You would have a crater about 1/3 of a mile wide, complete destruction about 7 miles across, and the more destruction would go further out. Here's what they call the kill zone. That's 17 miles across. That means a person in the open without protection would be killed instantly by radiation for a distance of 17 miles. So that is easier to understand to me than Rocky Mountain, North Carolina. So. Okay, questions, comments?
Control towers.
Yes.
Well, when you have a plane like that that's loaded with dangerous stuff, does anybody track it to know where it is?
Oh,
Which
that's a good idea.
Central.
That'd be a great idea.
They said
Let me
Raleigh-
write that down.
Raleigh knew that when they were coming in to make an approach to try to land,
Mm-hmm.
but who was in control before that?
That's a good question. Well, I guess Atlanta?
Well,
Atlanta.
the center that was
Center?
Center that would have been in control would have been Washington Center,
The Washington
which is
Center.
they control all
A
of
big
your
area.
those altitude, and,
Yeah,
and
that's
near
right.
there it would
Handed
have
off.
switched over to Atlanta Center if you were flying, or to Jacksonville Center, which
Yeah.
would have been in Florida. But in that area, that would be Washington Center.
Mhm.
Would know where they were, and
Yeah, where they were at all
They
time.
may or may not know. They know it was an emergency, but maybe not necessarily know exactly what
Right.
that emergency was.
Sidney Johnson, were they tracking?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the command center knew exactly where they were. That's where the wing commander was when he said they were losing radios, and he actually had to go out in his car and communicate with Keep 19 and said that, okay, it's time to come back. And so they saluted smartly and said, yes, sir. Actually, Major Tulloch did not agree with wing commander. He wanted to stay out and burn off some more fuel. But in the end, the wing commander wins. Anything else?
If he'd been lighter, he could have done a no flaps landing.
Yes,
keeping the flaps up. It would take a lot more runway, but he could have done that and probably could have done it successfully, but he had to.
But he was heavy on fuel.
A lot more.
That's why he
fuel.
wanted to stay out there and burn up some more
But
fuel.
they had no idea how much damage was
No.
the wing. They had no idea when it was gonna occur.
Afterwards, they calculated they lost a total of 51 tons of fuel. So all he knew was he was losing, pumps were failing, they were trying to balance the thing from one side to the next with fuel, and he knew it was pouring out. They were using it up with the other 6 engines. So he wanted to stay out there and burn some more fuel. Yes, sir?
So how long would 51 tons of fuel keep them up?
Oh, that's a good question.
I don't know what.
They refuel every 4 hours, and they took on 100,000 pounds. Yeah, 15 tons, that's 100 ton. About an hour. It's not a energy efficient airplane. Actually, you know, somebody said this is a big 8-engine. At times, it could be a 10-engine. When they had hound dog missiles slung underneath it. That was a jet engine.
Well, a rocket engine.
I think the hound dog was a jet.
Was it jet?
Because they would fire up that hound dog, and they could use it on takeoff. Use actual rockets that were under their wing. So,
Like in the fifties, they call them J-toes.
yeah, the J-toes were another thing. That was.
Oh, yeah. They were rockets.
They had one thing on and off. Yes, sir.
The term broken arrow, what
Oh,
was that common? Because I've understood that in Vietnam, if a platoon or even.
no, it was for.
Overrun, you get on the radio and broken arrow.
No, it's for nuclear weapons only. It was an accident involving a nuclear weapon. And, or it could be a detonation of a nuclear weapon or a accident that could have involved detonation. There are some other terms, see if I can find them here.
But it was not a term used in Vietnam when a unit was being overrun. That they needed
I don't know, maybe,
all the air support that could possibly muster.
that I do not know.
There were, and in the book you'll find it when you read it, there were, surprising to me, there have been a number of broken arrows.
Yeah,
This was only one of, how
there were
many? total?
36, I think.
Yeah,
That is official.
of close calls like,
Over what period of time?
well, I don't know,
What?
over what period of time? Sure.
During the 1960s and 70s. Now, some of the guys that did the same thing I did would argue with the government about, on FOIA requests, Freedom of Information. One of those guys said he thinks it was closer to 130.
Probably a lot more of them
Yeah.
that we never knew
Now,
about.
we do know that if I found the actual documents for this, if they had to jettison a bomb, you know, not drop it, but just jettison it, get rid of it, and if no one saw it, they didn't report it. And that's in the the reg. If it was not publicly seen, there is no need to officially announce that
It's
we
like
dropped
when a
it.
tree falls in the forest.
Exactly.
And nobody's there, it didn't happen.
Right.
Excuse me, what, you know when they quit flying the G models?
The G model, right after this accident, they grounded them.
Yeah, I was on a SAC base at Loring Air Force Base, 2 wings of 52s there, and I was thinking that they were.
Now, the ones that went through this modification called Hard Shell 2, those wings were fixed. This airplane was supposed to go through that
It was
modification
scheduled, yeah, it was
in
scheduled
May.
to go through in May, and this
Yeah.
happened in January.
Yeah, this happened in January. It was on the books to go through the same modification. It cost I think it was $200 million total project. Anybody else? Okay, let's go drive on. In order to carry out their war plans to drop these 2 H-bombs, it would take 3 people in that airplane at that time. And the pilot, the electronic warfare officer, and the radar bombardier. The pilot, he had a simple control right by his left elbow. And it was simply a nuclear consent on and off. He'd break a safety wire and consent to drop. That would send 28 volts of electricity downstairs to the radar navigator. The next guy that had to do something was the electronic warfare officer. And his was a mechanical hard link. He would lean over by his right foot and undo a handle like a starter rope on a gasoline lawnmower, but costed a lot more. He would break the seal and pull up. And what that did was extract a steel pin. This is in the bomb bay. The bomb would be held up in the airplane by this giant chain. And what he was doing was extracting a steel pin, a safety pin. This didn't cause the bomb to drop. This was just, it pulled out an actual safety device. The third device was by Gene Shelton. He had a lot of things. All these things were his controlled. One of them was called DCU-9A. Actually, he had 2 of them, one for each weapon. And this is what that device looked like. He would break that wire, the seal. They all had seals. If you came back and you had a broken seal, you had to talk to some people with a lot of brass on their head. This was the only switch that required 2 hands to operate for him. With one hand, he would push down on this, a spring-loaded device, and the other hand would turn it. So the indicator was on safe. And when he did that, this light would light up. That meant that electrical power from the pilot was connecting to him. Then he, in turn, would turn it to ground or air, one of those 2 things, ground burst or air burst. The ground burst, actually, there was another component of ground burst called lay down. I'll get to that in a minute. But when he did that, this device back in the bomb would flip over from safe to arm. That meant there were other devices in the bomb that had to happen, but I'll go into those in just a minute. One of them was called a pull-out. Here's where you looked at that arm safe switch. But there were a pull-out port. And what that did, this is called a dish generator. And it's like the button on your gas grill that makes that little noise when you ignite, the igniter. That's what it does. It's a very simple igniter. When the bomb drops, it pulls those pull-out rods out, upward just a little bit before they break. And they create a spark. And that tiny spark begins the process. There's 2 of them. There's 2 of everything in the bomb, I believe. But that tiny spark would start a thermal battery heating, a very small thermal battery. They didn't carry batteries that needed to be charged all the time. This was self-heating. It took a few seconds to do it. That purpose was to start a bigger thermal battery from heating and making that big electrical charge that was going to be needed to detonate the bomb. But as the bomb was falling, here's the timer. It's a mechanical timer, and they could be set for 30 seconds or 60 seconds. the purpose of the mechanical timer is to give the crew in the airplane time to get away from the blast. Yes, ma'am. And to move on. You're exactly right. But that's just a simple mechanical. It's not electrical. They used electrical devices and chemical devices and mechanical. So this bomb had other things. You see, Robert, these ports here, there's these holes on the side of it. That was the static to balance the air pressure, because there was a barometric switch inside that said, okay, the bomb is falling. There was also a trajectory switch inside that said, okay, the bomb is moving. The clock ran and gave them the time. The batteries were heating up, charging a giant capacitor with I don't know how much electrical, but it took a lot to collapse that plutonium did. And when all those things happen, you got the blast. The laydown. The laydown was a ground detonated bomb, but it would lay there for a certain amount of time and then detonate. There was always some clown back at the base that had this cutout, and he would spray paint it on the side of the bomb. And what that said in Russian was, "Hey, Dmitri, how far can you run in 3 minutes?" And that ain't gonna be far enough.
No way.
On the 50th anniversary of the crash, we had an unusual meeting, and we're at the site where that secondary lies buried. There's you can just make out Big Daddy's Road. This gentleman right here, actually, his name is Guy Altasser. He actually loaded the bomb on the plane that night. This fellow here, Billy Reeves, was an 18-year-old. He lived about a couple of hundred yards that way. He saw it. He saw it crash that night. That's me shaking hands with Adam Maddox. And there's Jack Revelle. And this was the current fire chief for the Faro Volunteer Fire Department. He's the one with Billy that made barbecue. And they had invited a bunch of people, and we had that was really impressive to me, to meet Adam Maddox at the site. And he had never met Jack Revelle.
Now, the guy in the white shirt, is he the
That's-
one?
that's
is he
Billy
the one
Reed.
that was a senior in high school?
Yes, he was 18 years old.
Okay, well,
That's him.
And so he's the same age as I am. 'Cause
Okay.
I was a senior in high school.
Okay. But he lived just right nearby.
Yeah.
And he helped me a bunch because he knew all the characters around. But that was really impressive. I figured out, I got the deed where the government bought the easement and found out where the center of it was, and we went there and that's where it was. So that secondary is 180 feet down, plus or minus 10 feet.
How do they know that if they never could recover it?
Say again?
How do they know it's 180 feet down if they couldn't recover it?
That they could recover, it could be recovered, I think.
That's right.
I mean, you know, it wasn't too long after that, they rescued miners in Chile. Remember that?
Yeah.
From miles down, and they were human beings. So if you can do that, I think you can dig down 180 feet.
Did they ever revise the message, the 4 points?
I'm sorry?
Did they ever revise the message? There's no danger.
There's
Did they
4
ever
points.
revise
Oh,
the message?
no, that was a one-time deal. That was, you know, some guy. No, they said they were digging for an ejection seat. That's why they dug for 5 months. Yeah. But the reason they quit digging and filled it in was they said the cost they said they could put in cofferdams, you know, and go down and recover it, but the cost of that type of operation exceeded the cost of the material they would be recovering.
What about radiation leakage of the?
Well, that was beside the point. How much does the stuff cost? That was
Talking money, we're talking money.
Yeah, we're talking money now. You're just talking other stuff. People dying, but that. Where was I? Oh, the next day, or rather the same day, Jack Revelle and I went out to Shackelford Road. He hadn't been there in 50 years. So he wanted to see where that bomb in the tree was, and he walked right up to it and pointed at it. And that's where that bomb in the tree was. That was spooky. That was, anyway. A few years after that, we got the marker put up about it. They actually put it up in Eureka instead of Faro because Eureka has more traffic. They have to go by how many vehicles go past it. John Oliver found out about it on his show, his HBO, last week, News Tonight. He had a different thought about what they should have on there. I cleaned it up a little bit there, but he said it was really strange. You have no idea what nearly happened here. So there's Jack and his three guys. The guy in the green shirt, the one on the left, that's Larry Lack. He was the one that hollered up, Lieutenant, we found the arm safe switch. So they're all gone now. We decided that some other heroes were the firemen of the Faro Fire Station. And so we put up this plaque. We had this plaque made. It named all the crew members, and it talked about the first to respond, the people from the volunteer fire station. That took a lot of courage. When this happened, they went to their fire truck, started it up, opened the doors. They were looking right down Big Daddy's Road, and they said all they could see was fire from side to side. And their unpaid job was to drive toward it. That took something. Now, they weren't the only volunteer fire station. There was about 20 of them all over that end of North Carolina that showed up from all angles. So the volunteers of volunteer fire departments are real heroes to me. That same day, Jack and I went over to Seymour Johnson, the EOD unit, and talked to those guys. This is their inner sanctum. They got mean-looking toys there. Anyway, that was something to see the modern versions of Jack Revelle talking to him. These are the people that would do what he did 50 years ago before that. So there's Jack in his T-shirt that says, Explosive Ordnance Disposal. On the back it says, if you see me running, try to keep up. So Jack passed away in 2020. He was quite a character. I really enjoyed knowing Jack Revelle. Also Adam Maddox. They're very, very good character, good men to know.
I think you said he ended up working for the state of North Carolina.
Yes, he did. Adam did. In education. This was some of the findings, the official findings. This is one of the few accident findings where they didn't blame somebody. Usually somebody gets blamed. So they identified the weakness of it and tied it back to that technical order, that high stress 2, that's what it was, 5 May 61. Whoops, I'm sorry. They also said the fact that a B-52G wing had experienced a similar failure during cyclic testing was not known down at the
Our
operating.
son was born May 5th, 1961.
Pardon me?
Our son was born May 5th, 1961.
Really?
Just wanted to let you know.
Okay.
He's special.
SAC went out of existence in 1992. The last commander-in-chief, that's what CINC means, that commander-in-chief SAC. The last commander-in-chief is General George Butler, and he said this: the capacity for human error, human failure, mechanical failure, or misunderstanding is virtually infinite. I came to fully appreciate the truth. We escaped the Cold War without a nuclear holocaust by some combination of skill, luck, and divine intervention, and I suspect the latter in greater proportion. Say amen to that. Here's another statement I really like.
Bradley.
General Omar Bradley. We live in an age of nuclear giants and ethical infants. We have achieved brilliance without wisdom and power without conscience. We have grasped the mystery of the atom and rejected the Sermon on the Mount. We know more about war than we know about peace. We know more about killing than we know about living. Isn't that a powerful statement? And Omar Bradley knows he's the General Omar Bradley. Okay. Any more questions, comments? I got one more section. Yes, sir.
Oh, okay. I was just gonna say, as a comment, one of my physics professors at NC State had worked on the Manhattan Project
Oh, really?
in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And by the time we were ready to drop the bomb, we dropped leaflets in Japan
Yeah.
that we have this terrible weapon, you either surrender or you're gonna regret it.
Or you're going to have a bad
We
day.
didn't get to it, we dropped it, and then a few days later, the same thing. We dropped more leaflets, and then so a few
That's
days
a
later, we dropped the second one. And then
That was a
after that,
great
we sent
ethical
more leaflets
conundrum.
with the same message. They surrendered, and we had no more atomic bombs. We only made 3.
That's right. You ran out of them. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am. Bernita Reed.
My question is this: if you hadn't have been given that book by Joel Jr., would anybody be talking about this?
Oh, I really don't know.
Probably not.
Well, when I started, I went down and started going around Faro, knocking on doors and telling people I was interested in that, and they said, we can't talk about that. I said, well, it was 50 years ago. You know what happened 50 years before that? The Wright brothers. So that's the perspective there. Yes, ma'am.
We knew Joel when he had about 5 pages with the outline of and he gave it to us to read and see if we had found any mistakes. And we
Yeah.
were just looking at it,
It grew.
and it grew.
It grew like Thompson.
Who invited these people?
Was there not a similar accident in Spain or in Portugal?
I'm sorry?
Wasn't there a similar accident where we lost
Oh, yeah, Spain.
Spain and Portugal? Is
That airplane was from Seymour Johnson also.
Yeah, that got ripped up though.
Yeah, it was a mid-air collision between the B-52 and KC-135.
But it dropped 2 bombs.
You're right, one of them went in the water. Navy had to fish it out. Took them a long time. Anybody else? Okay, one more segment, and then you'll be tested to see. In 1950s, we as a nation were deathly afraid of the Russians coming, killing us. We were especially afraid of what they call leadership decapitation. That's one bomb right on Washington DC, and we got no more leadership. So a lot of smart people got together and decided the way you get around that is to use pre-delegated authority. That's where you pre-delegate this to the other commanders that have nuclear weapons, and there are the 5 commanders. Now both the Army and Navy has tactical nuclear weapons, but only SAC has the long-range strategic bombers. Now this may come as a shock, but there is some inter-service rivalry between the Navy and the Army. The Navy didn't like the Air Force didn't like the Navy, and the Army didn't like anybody. So each service had their own war plan, which could result in some really bad confusion in attacking targets. Here's an example. One high-value target in the Soviet Union would be hit by a Jupiter missile, a Thor missile, an Atlas missile, and 3 H-bombs dropped from 3 different B-52s. So what we needed was a plan, one single plan, not everybody having their own plan. And we needed a traffic cop, a really tough traffic cop. So finally, on 16 August 1960, by order of Secretary of Defense Thomas Gates and directed by President Eisenhower, a strategic planning staff would be established and a new type of war plan would be created and presented to President Eisenhower for his approval before the end of his term in 1960, just 4 months away. It was to be a single plan, a single integrated plan called SIOP. That's what the SIOP stands for. The 62 stands for Fiscal Year 62, which started on 1 April 1961. It would be the most complex, the largest war plan ever created. It would synchronize the entire nuclear forces of the United States. It would add any new weapon program as they were being added into the mix, such as nuclear submarines and ICBMs as they became operational. It would be designed to effectively destroy all Soviet states, including Red China. It was to be executed either in retaliation or in a preemptive measure. Now, it would take one tough SOB to get this plan done in 4 months. And this was just the guy. Oh, wait a minute, that's not him. That's Jack D. Ripper from Dr. Strangelove. It was this guy, Hertz LeMay. No, that wasn't him. Hey, they look a lot alike, don't they? Okay, no, it was really going to be this guy, Thomas Power. Commander SAC would be in charge of it. And since it was going to be, he was also Commander SAC, it was going to be done at his base, Omaha, and he came up with a number of people, experts that he wanted, number 269 people, and they would be made up of all 4 services. The Navy had slots for 29 experts. The Army had 10, the Marines had 3, and the remaining 227 went to the Air Force. That was strange. Some of the information is still classified and may never be declassified. The paperwork alone weighed over 9 tons. So this was the plan for Tommy Powers to get his bombers going, and he got it made. He got the plan. They presented it to the president. It was signed on 20 December 1960. And even though he approved it, Eisenhower said he was both shocked and horrified by the extent of the plan. it had evolved into overkill. His science advisor said it would kill 4 or 5 times over someone who was already dead. Ike told his naval aide, PSYOP frightens the devil out of me. And Army and Navy leaders, as well as scientists in the White House, were concerned that the fallout from the weapons would be a hazard to ourselves. So, there it was. We had the plan. All we needed was an execution of the plan. So, the execution called for a thoroughly developed, clearly understood, well-rehearsed operational plan that could be implemented with a single decision by the President. PSYOP was as all-inclusive as it possible to make it. It required a split-second reaction under penalty of catastrophic failure. PSYOP could not be stopped once it was started. So 2 things I want you to remember there. A single decision by the President started it, and it could not be stopped once it was set in motion. And this is how it was set in motion. There were a ring of 4 of these signaling rockets around Omaha, Nebraska. And when the time came and the President said go to war, headquarters SAC, the command post there, would launch one of these things, and it had a pre-recorded message in it, and it would broadcast until it was exhausted and fell to earth, and then the next one would launch, and it would broadcast until it fell to earth. And this is the voice message that it transmitted, something like this. Sky King, do not answer, do not answer. This is Grand Slam. This message in 2 parts. Part 1, authentication code, and then it will give a code. Part 2, India, and it will give some letters. I say again, and it would repeat that over and over. That was the message to those guys in those B-52s. They'd write it down. They would see, did that match up with their codes? They would decode it. Did all 3 of them agree with each other? And if they agreed, then they would open up their secrets box. They had a heavy iron box that was locked with 2 locks, 2 combination locks. One by the pilot, one by the radar navigator. They had their own private combinations. So they would unlock it and take out envelopes, 1 envelope for each, just like in Dr. Strangelove. 1 envelope for each one of the crew members, and that told them who they were going to kill and how they were going to do it. So let's look at the personality of General Thomas Power. A Boston newspaper interviewed him and asked, where's the role for restraint in this war plan? And Thomas Power said, restraint? Why are you so concerned about saving their lives? The whole idea is to kill the bastards. Look, at the end of the war, if there are 2 Americans and 1 Russian alive, we win. And he also told President Kennedy on September 1961, the time of our greatest danger of a Soviet surprise attack is now and during the coming year. If a general atomic war is inevitable, the United States should strike first. This guy was telling the President of the United States, we need to go ahead and strike right now. That was in '61. He retired 3 years later, but Kennedy had low regard for him. Here's what Horace Wade, General Horace Wade, who worked for Thomas Power, said. I used to worry about General Power. I used to worry that General Power was not stable. I used to worry about the fact that he had control over so many weapons and weapon systems and could, under certain circumstances, launch the force. Back in the days before we had real positive control, SAC had the power to do a lot of things, and it was in his hands, and he knew it. Kennedy said power was colder and scarier than LeMay. LeMay said power was the saddest. So, this is for you, your homework. Think about this. This is the conditions in place on January 21st, 1961. Pre-delegated authority was already authorized. PSYOP was authorized. Chrome Dome was authorized. Airborne alert just started just 3 days before the crash. The B-52s were loaded and in the air, and General Thomas Power was in command of them. So, what do you, if there had been an accident, detonation, what do you think Thomas Power would have done? Would he have used it as an excuse, even if he knew it was an accident? He could say, we're being attacked. Talking about accidents, here's the probability of an accident according to Oscar Morgenstern, who is a physicist. Someday there will be an accidental explosion of a nuclear weapon. The human mind cannot, it should be cannot, construct some, who wrote that? Construct something that is infallible. The laws of probability virtually guarantee such an accident. This guy, I think, was a real hero for us. His name's Bob Purifoy. He's passed away in 2017. He was a nuclear weapons engineer, vice president at Sandia. Sandia is the national labs that made hydrogen bombs. Yeah, it's in Albuquerque. Excuse me, let me go back just a minute. Albuquerque, New Mexico. So he told me that he asked me how many miles of wiring did I think it was in a B-52. I said, I have no idea. He said, I don't know either, but it's got to be a lot, miles and miles of wiring. And he said, and no one can predict how they will behave, especially in a mid-air breakup. Now his team found 6 occasions of mysterious electrical shorts occurring on planes that had returned without any problems. In other words, they didn't have any problems at all. They were uneventful flights, not mid-air breakups. Some were on returning SAT training missions with the weapons still in the bomb bays, but with the arm safe switch inside a bomb somehow moved to the arm position. He said that kept him up nights. Goldsboro kept this guy, put him on a personal quest. He spent the rest of his career trying to, and he did, make nuclear weapons safer. And the engineers knew that accidental arming was not caused by the crew members because the lead seals were still intact. And all the crew members knew that if you come back with a lead seal broken, that could be the end of your career. This is the findings that Sandia Labs found. There was a gnawing worry about the switch. The fact that the electrical solder melts. Wire insulation becomes unpredictable during a fire, and it comes relatively easy to get a 28 volts of direct current across the terminals of a safety device. It is thus possible for electric current to actually jump from one contact switch point to another, and the molten solder of an aircraft flash fire or explosion, even if the switch itself is unsafe. So that was what really worried Bob Purifoy. He was responsible for a program called ENDS, Enhanced Nuclear Detonation Safety. He was responsible for getting tamper-proof arming switches. That means if you try several times and fail, it would lock down, and you'd have to take the weapon apart. He came up with PALS, for permissive action links. That's an electromechanical lock for a single pilot airplane. He could take off. He couldn't control the arming of the weapon until they gave him by radio the 4 digits combination to unlock it. So, ask you again about those conditions that were there that night, and what you think Thomas Power would have done if there had been a detonation. And Bob Purifile said if that arm safe switch was on arm, if the bomb didn't go off, the government should want its money back. That was saying it would have gone off. So, here's a rule of nature. The lesson will be repeated until it is learned. But my favorite lesson is this one. We know more about war than we know about peace. Isn't that a great statement? So that finishes my program. This is the shamelessly commercial aspect of the program. I do have a few books if you want to buy them. I want to buy one.
You say your assignment will be to read the book in the library. And
Meet back
he
here.
moves in here in
Yeah.
May. This is when he gets quizzed about the book.
Wait a minute. I will be quizzed by the Yes, sir.
My question, is it safe to assume in the 60s, we had a B-52 or similar plane in the air at all times with nuclear weapons armed? And has this carried over to modern day?
No.
Submarines?
Chrome Dome ended in what, 68?
I think that's what you said. Yeah.
We've
Yeah,
got
68.
16 tube guided missile submarines. And when they leave port, they have, the captain nor the navigation crew has no idea whatsoever where
Right,
they are
they're just
going.
gonna go out
And
there
they'll
and
be
sit.
gone for a year.
They'll go out there and sit.
And they got 16 tubes all loaded.
Well, you said we have 16 submarines about
Wherever.
nuclear weapons armed, ready to go?
I have no idea what,
And they are stealthy as they can possibly be. And the US Navy themselves, if they spot one and can prove it, they get all sorts of honors.
We had no idea that this was happening back in the 60s. Had no idea it
Yeah.
happened, as a matter of fact.
any other questions, comments, insults?
Sure.
Looking at you, Bill.
Thank you. We look forward